Now, more than ever before, it's becoming increasingly clear the mental well-being of professional athletes is directly tied to their physical performance both on and off the playing field, and professional sports teams around America are taking notice and investing more money into the mental side of the game. According to the Bureau of Labor and Statistics, the overall employment of sports psychologists are expected to grow up to 7% between 2023 and 2033, respectively, more than the average of any other occupation. Over 13,000 openings for psychologists are expected on average over the next decade to replace professionals who change career courses or exit the labor force entirely to retire, according to the Bureau. An elite athlete is indeed a valuable performer, but it's also important to note that they're just like any of the rest of us and a valuable human being, according to my friend Dr. Scott Goldman, who is a sports psychologist and consulting performance psychologist for the Golden State Warriors. Dr. Goldman says he views his role as a sports psychologist who is a 360-degree resource for the entire organization, being embedded in every aspect of the organization and supporting both the athletes, the coaches, the management team, and supporting personnel who are in charge of managing every aspect of talent development, including acquisition within the organization. He was one of the first clinically trained psychologists to serve as an integral part of both a college and professional sports teams, psychology and mental performance staff. His early full-time position with the National Collegiate Athletic Association, or the NCAA, was with both the University of Arizona and the University of Michigan. Dr. Goldman has also spent time with the Miami Dolphins, the Detroit Lions, and he's also consulted for the Washington Wizards and the Chicago Cubs. His signature achievement may have been the development of the Athlete Intelligence Quotient, which is an assessment tool specifically to see the cognitive and performance-specific traits which contribute to athletic success. And Dr. Goldman joined me this week to tell me more about his signature achievement and the inroads he's making to improve athletes' mental and physical performance both on and off the field of play. He was also gracious enough to share his thoughts on the future of sports psychology and how it will evolve over time. So without further delay, I'm Kevin McShann. Let's have this conversation. Scott, if you're ready, I'll take a moment to welcome you to the program. And I'm super excited to dive into your journey in sports psychology this afternoon, my friend. It's delightful to see you, and thanks so very much for being here.
Oh, thank you.
Absolutely. Now, Scott, I know that you are a consulting sports psychologist or consultant for the Golden State Warriors, my friend, and I know that you provide them with organizational knowledge from a psychological perspective when it comes to talent acquisition in every aspect of the organization, whether it's working with athletes, coaches, or management, my friend. So tell me about your work, my friend, and what makes it so fabulous.
Sure. So I mean, regardless of which organization I work for, I try to keep the resource that I serve and provide relatively uniform. I think of psychology as the study and understanding of human behavior as well as human interaction. And that kind of can be folded into anything. Oh, thank you. So, I mean, some of my answer is actually folded into your question. So let's start with that part. You identified players, coaches, management, and also owners. So if you think about a 360-degree ability to make impact, right? That's the kind of way that I like to do the job. That's the way I see it. So, as one owner who I report to said to me, he said, Scott, just help whoever's in front of you. So there are times where I'm helping with hiring a coach. There's times where I'm helping with evaluating a player. There's times where, I'm dialoguing with the player directly, sometimes talking to a coach about a player, sometimes talking to a coach about their coaching technique, sometimes talking to front offices. So it's interesting because I always think of human beings as being very complicated and complex. And it's funny because I think sometimes in sports we want quick and easy answers, and that becomes a really tough marriage. So if I were to try to give you a more succinct or simpler answer, I think the way I would phrase it is the way I see my role in any organization that I work for is one where I use my psychological training to have impact and to be of service to anyone and everyone within the system.
Yeah, absolutely. And Scott, I'm also curious to get your opinion on how do you think the conversation around mental health has evolved over the years as professional athletes face increased pressure to perform both on and off the court or field or service play, considering the societal dynamics that athletes are placed under today, my friend. So how do you think the mental health conversation has evolved for athletes over time?
Yeah, so I love getting asked that question. So thank you for the opportunity to kind of pull on that thread. The optimist in me is really grateful for how much we're talking about mental health and awareness. So I love the fact that the stigma seems to be reduced, that people are more open and receptive to utilizing the service for when they're struggling and also utilizing the resource for when they're doing well and they just want to do better. So in some ways, I think it's great that society, the community, both in and out of sport, is becoming more comfortable with mental health. What I would put on my colleagues and myself that we should be doing a better job on is defining what mental health and wellness really is. What is performance psychology? What is clinical psychology? What is the merger and marriage between those two? So I find we're at a paradox a little bit, which is I've never been a part of the professional space. And I've been doing this for almost 30 years now. I've never been a part of the sports space where we're talking about psychology as much as we currently are, and yet there's more confusion than ever before.
Yeah, so let's dive into that a little bit. How do you think performance and clinical psychology are interconnected, my friend?
So I try to think of three domains that psychology can really have impact and influence. One is in the clinical side. So think things like depression, suicidal ideation, substance abuse, maybe marital discord, those kinds of things. The second bucket is in optimal performance. I remember I was working with an Olympic athlete once, and she said to me, I have the third fastest time in the world. And I said, that's amazing. How can I be of service? And she said, well, I'd really like the first. And I was like, oh, well, what's the difference between your, personal best, your PR time and first place in the world? And she said 3/100ths of a second, which is about the length of a sneeze. So it was a really neat challenge working with her as we were trying to figure out what things could we do between her ears that could improve her by the difference of a sneeze, but also would make her the fastest person in her event in the world. So that's bucket two. And then I think bucket three is the environment. Sometimes we call that culture or system dynamics, but what we're really talking about is the relationship dynamics between all the different individuals in the system. And where I think things get a bit complicated is I think a healthy environment helps foster, optimal performance and really good mental health. I also think really healthy individuals can foster a healthy environment. So when we think about these three domains of where we can make impact, I actually see them more as a blend and a mix and an overlap. It's, you don't just work on one of these three areas and not have it carry over or cascade over into the others.
Yeah, and Scott, I'm fascinated to ask you about developing trust with athletes because, with the increased sort of media echo chamber that athletes are in today, that they're looked at as sort of role models and societal answers to solving problems. So, in your role as a psychologist, I'm curious to ask you what goes into developing a relationship or an atmosphere of trust when you work with athletes. What are your thoughts there?
Yeah, no, that's a cool question. Let me digest on that for a sec. I guess the short answer is I don't know universally what creates trust. What I can tell you what I try to do and what I aim to do. One is I try to be very authentic. I think that a lot of these players, the world starts to change around them as they get really good. So sometimes, like one of the questions I really like asking athletes as I'm learning and understanding them is I say, at what age did people start treating you differently because of what you could do during a game? And it's amazing because I'm finding currently players are reporting that people are treating them differently at younger and younger stages. So one is I just try to be authentic with them, right? Because everybody else is angling for something, their time, their attention, their money, whatever the case may be. So that's probably number two is I try to ask very little of them. I don't ask for autographs. I don't ask for testimonials to put on a website. I don't even have a website. I don't ask to promote our relationship in a way that's exploitative. I just, it's amazing when you spend time with some of these young men and young women, you watch how, cousins and uncles and, everybody starts to come out of the woodwork and they're asking for something, whether it's tickets or an autograph or maybe even, $50,000 to buy a car wash. So I think one is to be authentic. Two is to be of service. to try to be a resource to be for them, not to mutate the relationship into it being something for me. I think the third element of trust is I try to um, I try to be competent. And what I mean by that is there are times where we're asked questions as a psychologist, and people assume because of our training and our expertise that we have that answer. But there but I think it's important to come from a place of science, research, that when someone asks, should I go left or should I go right in my life? Should I transition away from sport? Or some other kind of sophisticated question, that we don't just give them an opinion the way any other advice giver. Like, someone said this to me once, it really resonated. They said, anyone can be an advice giver. And you can get advice from a lot of people. You can get it from a faith-based, like a religious leader. You can get it from the person who cuts your hair. You can get it from the bartender that as you're waiting and having a drink. Like, anyone can be an advice giver in your life. And so I try, again, with that third bucket of being competent, I try to avoid being an advice giver, but rather to create a space and a place where they can process what's going on in their life. And rather than giving them answers or opinions, I try to ask meaningful questions that hopefully stimulates them to get to a conclusion or an awareness of what they're trying to unlock.
Yeah, that's totally makes sense, my friend. And Scott, I'll share just a little bit about myself. So my brother is actually an assistant sports psychology professor at Missouri State University, and he studies the relationship between the coach and the athlete relationship. And one of the things he always tells me is that we always want to meet sort of the athlete on the level that can sort of convey the most maximum level of response, whether that be through conversation or performance. So I'm curious to ask you to build on what do you think it means to establish an effective coach-athlete relationship, considering today's dynamics and societal pressures. What are your thoughts there?
Yeah. God, good question. Another good one. You're teeing me up with some good questions here. I think the player coach relationship's a really special one. And it's interesting because it's never been as disrupted or fragile or interfered with as it is right now. There's so many people that have access to the coaches and to the players, support staff, even direct messaging on social media, etc. So I find what's amazing is when coaches are forging this relationship with players and players are forging the relationship with coaches, that it really becomes an element of some of the things we talked about with myself, I guess, authenticity and being of service and being competent. So that way, again, some of the best coaches I've been around, they have this beautiful ability to be invested in the success of someone else. I mean, that kind of, to me, is like one of those definitions of coaching, is when you are invested in the well-being of others and making them great. And then from the player, because I think the relationship goes in both directions, I think it's when the player commits to the coach and the coach's philosophy. Like if you've ever read General Stanley McChrystal and his book on leadership, I think it's called Myths and Truths and Myths of Leadership. I don't know. First of all, brilliant writer, brilliant leader, General Stanley McChrystal. One of the concepts he talks about in the book is that leaders are neither made nor born, but rather leaders are forged by the first follower. Or at least that was my interpretation of what he wrote. And so what he was saying was like, any leader can say, hey, let's go storm that hill. but it's the first follower who says, yes, I'm with you. So I think sometimes what's really interesting to watch is when you have a coach who says, this is what we're going to do. And then he looks in the room and the room's kind of silent until that first player goes, yes, I'm with you, coach. So I think when players commit to the process and the vision, pretty amazing things happen.
Yeah, absolutely. And, Scott, at the beginning of this, we mentioned that you try to put your fingertips on every aspect of an organization, supporting every department and major player within an organization. So I'm also curious to ask you about how organizations in sports and organizations in general can sort of effectively manage their people, because I always, when I work with so outside of hosting this podcast, I talk to businesses about the importance of hiring folks with disabilities, for example, and the importance that can bring to an organization. So I'm curious to ask you about how organizations can really take the concept of their people being their best asset, and how do you think they can manage them effectively? What are your thoughts there?
Yeah, so all right. I love it. I love where we're going. This is fun. Thank you. Um I think a lot of times when people are approached with this question, they want to guide towards the positive, the kind of like Ted Lasso like stuff, the real kind of emotional support kind of mechanism. And I do believe in that value wholeheartedly. However, I would add that there's also a level of high performance that comes from coaches that take on a more accountability or authoritarian type approach, where they're direct and they're strong in their language and they can be hard, as some of the terminology. And so I think when we talk about getting the best out of people, I start with this baseline: competence. You have to make the right call. If the vision of leadership is we're going to go and 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 build this widget, that vision has to be right. So I think you start with competence, whether you are a love them up coach or a, kind of really hold their feet to the fire type of coach. I think either one, you have to start with having the answers to the test. You have to be competent. Now, to go to the second tier, whether it's being supportive or being about standards, I think you have to make sure that you don't go too extreme in either one. I think when you're too supportive, you sometimes miss the opportunity to push people beyond their comfort zones where great things can happen. And I think if you're too forceful, you run the risk of turning people off. So if I were to encourage people to get the best out of folks, I think it's a formula that's really high support times high standards. Don't lower your standards just to be liked by your team. At the same time, don't be a jerk just because you're so driven to attain your goal. So high standards, high support is the direction I would always encourage people to go to.
Yeah, absolutely. And Scott, based on your experience, I'm curious, when you work with athletes, how do you determine they're ready or prepared to maximize their peak level of mental performance, which will also allow them the mental clarity to perform their best regardless of the sport? So, how do you help athletes sort of create mental clarity so that they can maximize their mental and physical performance? What are your thoughts there?
Yeah, I think that there's two overarching themes. One is remove obstacles, right? So there's a famous psychiatrist, Joseph Yalom, who said that people naturally want to grow, and our job is just to remove the obstacles that get in their way. So I think step one would be removing obstacles, and whatever that obstacle might be. It could be anxiety, it could be getting over the trauma, and I say lowercase t trauma, not capital T trauma, but getting over the trauma of missing a shot or losing a game 2 weeks ago. But so first step is eliminating obstacles, identifying and eliminating obstacles. The second path is when no obstacles are present, but it's just the idea of, hey, I want to go from good to great. And some of the mechanisms of things that we can do to help people when they're already performing at an optimal level, but they just want to go, plus one, if you will. And sometimes those kinds of going from good to great, sometimes it's very simple. It's like, good sleep hygiene and, proper nutrition and making good choices or being completely present and focused at practice. Some of those things are pretty easy to execute. It's just a matter of reminding people of the discipline to do that to the craft. But then there's other techniques and elements like developing pre-shot routines or pre-performance routines where you get into a habit where you're almost like conditioning yourself. It's amazing because when you practice a skill set, you can do things. So there was a famous baseball player, God, I think this was like back in the 80s, Wade Boggs. He used to eat fried chicken before every game. And some people thought of it as him as a superstition, right? He was superstitious. Turns out it wasn't so much a superstition as it was he conditioned himself that by eating the same food before every game, it was like he was activating his mind. It was him turning on, hey, this is how my game starts. So that's one of the things that I'll do with some athletes is I'll ask them, I'll go like, hey, when does the game start for you? And some go, well, kickoff's at 1 o'clock on Sunday. And then it's like, okay, so when does the game start for you? And they'll go, actually, it starts Tuesday. And I go, what happens on Tuesday? And they walk me through this performance routine of like, well, Tuesday's where I kind of take care of all my stuff. I do my laundry. I talk to my wife. I find out if anyone needs tickets so I can get that settled. So that by Wednesday, I am just focusing totally on ball. So it's that kind of process. So sometimes it's just creating blueprints, right, to give people walkways.
Yeah, absolutely. And before I ask you about the athlete intelligence quotient, I'm going to ask you sort of not a selfish, but a curious question that I have for myself. So, Scott, I was born with spastic quadriplegia cerebral palsy. And I found out at the age of 9 that I wouldn't be able to walk for the duration of my life without the assistance of a walker or a wheelchair because of the severity of my cerebral palsy. I was also born 3 months premature, and I wasn't supposed to live past 3.5. And I'm curious to ask you about the importance of social relationships and social capital for athletes, because for me, part of the reasons I wanted to start this podcast is, sometimes it's more difficult for me to leave the house as a result of my disability. So I use this as sort of a social outlet and building what I call social capital. And I'm curious to relate that back to athletes in terms of working with them to understand how important it is for them to build sort of their social community of support, because no matter the level of competition, athletes will always be under pressure. So I'm curious to ask you the importance rather of social capital and community and how important that is to an athlete's success. What are your thoughts there?
I'm a little bit overwhelmed with a couple of different thoughts. I mean, one, I'm genuinely curious and intrigued by your own journey. It sounds like you would be an amazing resource to learn from. So I don't know if you want to go in that direction, but there is a part of me that starts with gosh, I feel like there's something that I could learn from you, and I'd love to learn from you.
Yeah, but you can ask me any questions you wish, my friend. Go right ahead.
Well, so if you had an opportunity to talk to an audience of athletes, what would be one of the valuable lessons that you've learned in your life that you think they would benefit from?
Scott, I start the majority of my speeches because I also do some professional speaking in terms of uh, outside of hosting this podcast, and I always say that your life is your victory lap, and I always tell people to make your circumstances into a vehicle of difference. So for me, I'll give you a quick story. So when I was 9 years old, I found out in the hospital conference room that I wouldn't walk for the duration of my life. And the next day I had to start my fourth grade year of elementary school. And my middle school principal, Dr. Carol Cruller, looked me in the eye after I had come back from the hospital. And she said the only limitations on your life are the artificial ones that you place on yourself personally. So for me, life, I always say, is a grand adventure, and we're always given sort of a life compass, and it's important to point it in the direction that we want to go. So it's less about focusing on restrictions, uh, more about sort of focusing on how your life experience can impact the most societal generation outside of yourself. Because if you contribute to society and its growth and advancement, and now this is just my view, your personal sort of accolades or achievements will take care of themselves because you're contributing to what I call the conversation of progress. So I hope that answers your question.
It does, and it reminds me of like one of my favorite quotes is from the movie Ratatouille. I don't know
Mm-hmm.
why, but I just first I find the movie to be super charming, but I love this quote. It just resonated with me where, he says, "Look, not everyone can cook, but a cook can come from anywhere." And so I've always felt the power of that, which is, you know, if you have a chance to sit down and listen to someone tell their story or talk about their journey or moments that were impactful in their life, like you even mentioning the principal of your school and the advice or the guidance that she gave you and how that resonated with you. And I go, gosh, like that's a really powerful message. And so I love the idea of gaining wisdom and knowledge from anywhere and anyone in any kind of opportunity. Each conversation that we have is such an opportunity for growth. So, like I'm really enjoying this conversation that you and I are having right now. And so I think that's an element to it, kind of circling back to the question that you asked. I just feel like this happened to me once where I was talking to a Hall of Fame quarterback. Like he was literally in the Hall of Fame in the NFL,
Mm-hmm.
and he still hangs around the team that I was working with. And I don't look much like a football player. I mean, I just don't. And I know that. And so it's funny because this guy, super nice guy, kind hearted person, this quarterback, he again Hall of Fame quarterback, and he was kind of busting my chops a little bit, where he was like, Goldman, what are you doing here, kind of thing, like you don't really belong, and he was joking about it, but I also felt a little bit of that sting, and I finally just said to him, I said, look, like the comment that he made that I finally fired back on was he said, if I was a rookie and I saw you, I'd be like, what the heck's that guy doing here? And I said to myself, you know what? If I was a rookie and I saw someone like me standing there, I would be thinking, I wonder what he's offering the organization because someone has invested the time, money, and energy to put him here. It must be very valuable. And the Hall of Fame quarterback goes, he's like, checkmate, Scott, you got me on that one. And I was like, cool. But I think the idea here is like, if you're at the airport or if you're on a podcast, or if you're on the sidelines or wherever you might be, having a conversation with someone and having a real authentic level of curiosity and intent to learn and understand gives us a wonderful chance for our own personal growth and development. So that's what, going back to your idea about the importance of social connection, I think it's everything.
Yeah, absolutely. Scott, building on your last answer, I'll share this one last piece of my personal story. So when I was a little guy, Scott, I spent 7.5 years in speech language therapy because when I would say words with L's or T's or S's, sometimes my brain thought faster of the word that came out of my mouth. And I'm always curious to ask professionals about the idea of overcoming adversity. Now, I've overcome adversity in my life a lot. I've had a total of 7 surgeries in my life, and I've spent more time in hospitals than I care to remember. But I always say that, overcoming adversity is, the answer to the test of adversity is resilience, my friend. So I'm curious about how do you think adversity and resilience are interconnected in sports and in life, my friend? What are your thoughts there?
Yeah, I mean, you might have a better answer than me, but I'll take a stab at it. Um, I think when we talk about adversity and resilience, I have a tendency to focus on drive. I think that all human beings possess some level of passion and some level of purpose. And I differentiate those two concepts. To me, passion is more of a selfish concept. Like passion is like what gets me, up and excited about the day. And purpose is really a little bit more selfless, where it's kind of like about what I can provide for the community. So, for example, like I'm really passionate about psychology. I love psychology. I love talking about psychology. I love practicing psychology. I'm passionate about psychology. But my purpose is really about my family. Like, to be able to provide for my wife and my kids and to support them, physically, psychologically, emotionally, financially. Like, that is, I feel like, my purpose in life. And so, um, I think when people face the adversity, and I don't know life that exists without some level of adversity in it, when people face it, and I think people rise and fall to their own threats and dangers, right? Like sometimes people will quantify or qualify adversity. Like, well, your adversity is much worse than my adversity, or my adversity is much easier than yours, or and I'm going like, you know, your worst day is your worst day, whatever that might be for whatever your reference is. And when you're going through that adversity, whatever that worst day is for you or whoever we're talking to, I tend to align with, well, what was the driver? What was your passion? What was your purpose that allowed you to kind of push through or persevere through that moment?
Mhm. Yeah, absolutely. Scott, one of your significant achievements or accomplishments within the field of sports psychology is the creation of the athletic intelligence quotient, my friend, where you look to test in terms of the cognitive abilities and the essential dynamics of acquiring or developing and applying sort of the science of technology and athletic skills to sports, my friend. So tell me about the athlete intelligence quotient, my friend, and what it's all about and why the test is so effective, my friend.
Well, thank you for the opportunity to discuss something that's been a real passion project throughout most of my life. The AIQ is meant, like, well, let me go back a step. when my partner Jim Bowman and I, when we created it, we started with the idea of trying to understand sport. And we saw sport as this evolving puzzle, this challenge, if you will, of something that couldn't really be solved, but was constantly being a quest. So we said, okay, well, if sports is this unsolvable puzzle, what kinds of cognitive abilities, what aspects of intelligence would be most needed? So we spent about 15 years, researching and developing what cognitive abilities we should measure. So if you think about, say, like a firefighter who enters a building and looks for people to save as well as potential threats or danger, that's very similar to a point guard in basketball trying to identify where to distribute the ball in transition basket, in transition offense. I think another element would be like a quarterback who, prior to the snap, has to look and identify defenses as well as identifying the mic, etc. So I think, and I'm grateful for Jim and in our partnership, because I think what we did was we found a way to help explain athlete and their successes and in their performances. And what's nice is it's become a resource to help make more well-informed decisions. It's a resource that helps people understand how an individual does it. Like, some people can do it with size. Some people can do it with strength. Some people can do it with a work ethic. And some people can do it with intelligence. Most people do it with some kind of gumbo mixture of it all.
Yeah, absolutely. And Scott, I'm curious to also ask you, what fascinates you most about working with athletes and studying, human behavior and applying a psychology to it, my friend? So, what fascinates you most about studying people and their behaviors, both in an athletic and life sense, my friend? What are your thoughts there?
So I started off where I worked in clinical hospital settings and was navigating and trying to be a resource for individuals who are suffering in some of the most extreme ways. And when I say extreme, I mean people who had attempted suicide, people who were abused as children. I mean, just heartbreaking stories. But within those heartbreaking stories, you could dial into their triumphs. You could dial into their resilience. And when I migrated away from working in the clinical hospital settings to the elite performance space, I found the extremeness to have a little bit of a parallel. It's different, but there is some shared qualities. So to be the very best of anything, whether it's violin playing, being a journalist, being a basketball player, etc., it requires a lot of sacrifice. It requires a lot of time and attention. And it's interesting because, like, people who have won like Super Bowls and world championships, I often ask them, I go, what did you feel in that moment? And the number one answer I get is relief. Like, they were just driven to this excellence. And when they finally attained a level that they were hoping to, as since they were a child dreaming, they felt relief. And so I guess when you ask me like what kind of fascinates me the most, it's on both ends of these extreme, it's both ends of the spectrum, the extreme ends of the spectrum, where people are just doing amazing things to get through the day. And I guess I've always been fascinated by what makes people who sit in those two spaces engage and continue on to forge with their day.
Yeah, and Scott, I know that you also have experience at the collegiate level, spending time at both the University of Michigan at Arizona in sports performance and psychology role, and I'm curious with the advancement of name, image, and likeness, and the increased pressure on college athletes today. I'm wondering your thoughts on how that has changed the college landscape from a psychology perspective, and what's the number one thing that you take away from your time working on the college end of things, my friend?
Yeah, cool. All right. I think I would start with by saying I don't know. I think
Okay.
I think the I think the sands of time are still forging this. But here are some initial thoughts, but I would not hold them to be pillars.
Self-evident. Yeah, of
Yeah,
course. Yeah.
I think we've got I think we and I don't know if this is good or bad. I think that's the other thing is sometimes people are quick to make a judgment, right? And I'm going, I'm still kind of just more curious.
Hmm.
So what I'm seeing so far is a shift in power. That the NIL and the transfer portal has given the players power that they did not have before. And in some ways there's a benefit where they can leave and they can navigate their own space and they have the ability to do things that they didn't have before. They have some freedom and some mechanism. So I'm going, isn't that wonderful? On the other side of things though, instead of navigating through the discomfort or navigating through the conflict, they can just avoid it. And I think sometimes there's something to be missed for that. So for example, if they get benched, they can just go to a different school versus trying to fight through that playing time issue and become a starter. And I just think to myself, sometimes when you persevere through that discomfort is where you can really get good at something. So I think, like a lot of things in life, how we use the resources that we have. Like the internet is an amazing thing. The internet gives us information at the speed of light.
Hmm.
However, the internet can also be really detrimental in ways where it's like, yeah, it gives us information at the speed of light, but sometimes it's hard to trust the accuracy of that information because we don't know where the source is coming from. And so I just think, like a lot of things in life, there's this level of complexity, and the NIL and transfer portal is so complex of a situation right now that we just can't figure things out. So I'm waiting to see how the world
Sort of
stabilizes
adapt.
this.
Yeah.
Yeah, and my hope is, like a lot of things, the market has a tendency to naturally kind of auto-correct. Like if things are out of balance one direction or the other, the market has a tendency to kind of balance. Water does too. So I'm watching I'm watching the gosh, what was that? The seesaw, right? Like on the playground, that seesaw. Like I'm watching the seesaw of this transfer portal and NIL, and I'm waiting for it to stabilize.
Yeah, and during your time in the college sector, I know that you were one of the first sports psychologists to co-author the first National Athletic Trainers Association consensus statement regarding the treatment of student athletes and the first professional sports medicine organization to establish standards when it comes to that, my friends. So I'm wondering if you can detail that process for me and what you learned about student athletes throughout the course of that process as well.
So you've really done your homework. I mean, to pull out that NATA paper. So that was a benchmark paper. That was about 20, 25 years ago. And that paper, what was really nice and pioneering about it wasn't just a psychologist who constructed it. It was a psychologist, a head athletic trainer, a team physician, a lawyer. I'm trying to remember who else authored it. But what was nice was there was a shared vision amongst all of us that contributed to it of what would be in the best interest of student athletes and their well-being. That, and again, this was 20 years ago. Gosh, I sound old when I say that, but the idea was we thought that the demands of sport was going to come and have a tipping point, and what kinds of things could we do to help student athletes as they brace these upcoming challenges. So I think what was really neat about the article was how it was a multidisciplinary construct and therefore made it very comprehensive in ways of establishing best practices and recommendations for athletic departments to ensure the safety and well-being of the student athletes.
Yeah, absolutely. Scott, before I ask you my last question, I have one more for you, and that, my friend, is what do you think is the key to equipping athletes today at any sector or athletic skill level with the mental sort of intelligence and the emotional foresight they need for success? My friend, what are your thoughts there?
Um, That's a, I think you've stumped me on three or four questions here. Like again, I don't know because, and I don't know if this answers your question, but this is kind of where my brain goes when you asked it. Like parenting, like coaching, the secret is in the space between. And what I mean by that is like, I remember vividly teaching my children to ride a bike. And I remember for me, the challenge was knowing when to let go. If I let go too soon, they would fall and scrape their knee and they would cry, and I don't want them to be in pain. And if I held on too long, I felt like they would never have gained that level of balance and independence.
Mm-hmm.
So, similarly, I think when it comes to providing mental health resources and physical resources, it's really about knowing when to let go of the bicycle seat. Like, you let go too soon, and people might not be able to navigate their challenge. You hold on too long, and there might be a level of dependence. And so, I think that's probably the thought that I would give to that question.
Yeah, absolutely. And, Scott, I'm going to end with a two-part question. And, doing research for this story or this conversation, I found that the Bureau of Labor and Statistics tells me that over the next 10 years, the field of sports psychology will grow 7% faster than any other profession in terms of a job outlook because more than 13,000 sports psychologists will either retire or go on to another a chapter of their life and professional story, my friend. So why do you think there's been an increased investment in sports teams, willingness to employ people like you? And my last sort of question to that is when you look at your own life and legacy, Scott, how do you want that to be defined?
Um, so I think one of the reasons why it's expanding as a market is because of its utility.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, that's the nice thing, right? Is if things don't work, people stop doing it. So I'd like to think that as we continue to destigmatize mental health and wellness, we're encouraging people to then recognize its advantages. So I think one of the reasons why it's growing is because it works. Now, if I understand the second part of your question, and correct me, please correct me if I missed the detail, but the second part of the question was almost kind of like a legacy question, right? Like,
That's correct. Yeah.
yeah, when I think about my own legacy, which I haven't really spent much time doing, so I thank you for the question.
Mm-hmm.
I think I go with two ideas. One is to be of service to others. I really do value the opportunity to help. And then I think the other one is I just want to do cool shit with cool people.
Fair
And
enough.
and I look back at some points of my career and I've done some really cool shit with some really cool people. Like, um, there's just something to be said for when you're in like a really unique space. Like I'll give you a concrete example. I was with an NFL team and we got caught in a game that was paused by lightning strikes. And so the game was postponed or delayed. And we're all sitting in the locker room and the head coach comes to me and says, like, what do we do? Do we keep them activated, but we don't know when the game's going to start again? Do we shut them down? Does that risk injury? Like what? So I pulled from some literature and I referenced what some Olympic athletes do when it comes to like arousal regulation. And when I think about like track and field, where they have multiple heats, where they activate and then shut down, activate and then shut down. So I kind of proposed something that we ended up engaging in. And then while we were deactivated, waiting for this, weather delay to pass, we used it as an organic opportunity to kind of get to know one another. It was the first game of the year. And, everything is such a sprint to Sunday. All of a sudden, with little or no distraction, we were all just kind of hanging out in the locker room together. And so it became kind of fun. It was almost like we were having a little bit of a picnic, guys, pulled out their playing cards. Some were playing poker, some were playing dominoes, but we were just kind of hanging out. And I thought to myself, this is a pretty cool space. So I think about warm moments like that as doing cool shit with cool people.
Absolutely. And finally, Scott, tell me if people want to get connected with you, what's the best way they can do that?
Oh, I mean, I don't know. That's a good question. Like, I don't have a website or anything like that. I mean, if they're curious about the AIQ, they can go to the AIQ website, which is aiq.team. If they want to connect with me, I guess I'll just give out my email address, which is just my first name, S, right? Or the first letter of my first name, S, then my last name, Goldman, Goldman, at aiq.team.
Absolutely. And they can also connect with you on LinkedIn because that's how we found each other as well, right?
Oh yeah, that's a good one too. Yeah, I am on LinkedIn. I can't say that I'm on it every day or that I follow it, with a real high dedicated manner. But yeah, one thing I try to do, it's just important to me, is I try to answer every email and I try to answer every DM or contact that I get from whatever social media. I feel like if someone took the time to reach out to me, the least I can do is respond to it. So if I've never Googled myself, but maybe if you Google me, you'll find different avenues. But if you reach out, I'll do the best I can to respond.
Well, I'll add to that question for you. When I reach out or do my research on you, the first thing that comes up, my friend, is your LinkedIn profile, okay?
Oh, cool. So there you go.
So just to let you know. Well, Scott, I want to thank you for providing me with your years of experience and expertise in the field of psychology and sports and life and everything in between, my friend. I find you to be a fascinating person, and I found this to be a fascinating conversation. So I want to thank you for the privilege of engaging in conversation with you and for joining me this afternoon. It's most appreciated.
Oh, the pleasure's been all mine. I've really enjoyed the conversation, and it was also nice to get to learn a little bit about you and your story. So thank you for sharing, and this was a really fun engagement.